Welcome to Thrive Deeper, the show based on the Thrive Bible reading guides. This is an ongoing conversation about God's Word with Thrive author, Dr. Matthew Jacoby.
I'm back in the studio, Thrive Deeper, episode 179, Would you believe? There you go. My goodness, 179.
Been doing this a long time.
Well, we're actually looping back around, which is exciting because we get to take a second look at some of these things.
Yeah.
After I don't know,
and
years.
a deeper dive.
Yeah.
And I found with Ezekiel, man, this is an interesting book. The book of Jeremiah, there's quite a lot of repetition. I love the book of Jeremiah because it's so heartfelt. Ezekiel, there's a level of complexity to Ezekiel, but it's also what makes it so interesting.
Yes.
There are so many notable things throughout this. So lots to talk about today, Stu.
Definitely. As I was sort of preparing, I'm reading and going, man, there's some really interesting things that we'll unpack, I'm sure, today. So listeners, we are picking up Ezekiel, chapter 21, working through to chapter 32 today. And in historical context here is that Ezekiel is in the Babylonian exile with the people. This is probably before, at this point in time, Judah has fallen, or at least Jerusalem has fallen. At least Ezekiel doesn't know that. At this point in time, we would understand. But he's prophesying about the judgment that's coming, and the judgment that's going to come not only to Jerusalem, but ultimately through this passage about the judgment that's going to come to the region and to all the nations of the known world, really, at the time. But also insights into God's plans for restoration for the nation.
And the oracles of restoration are really going to begin in the second half of the book. At this stage, we're squarely in the lead up to the final destruction of Jerusalem. So there's been, the Babylonians have come in now already a few times, and they have spared the city, but the final destruction, the final stroke, is going to be this siege, and then the final destruction in 586 BC.
And remembering that Zedekiah had been appointed by the Babylonian king, but then he decided to rebel after about 10 years, I think, and this is where the final kind of, the Babylonians had enough. Nebuchadnezzar was coming in, and as you say, this was where we're at right at this point in time.
So Nebuchadnezzar, and this is something that was evident. We picked up on this theme, Stu, when we looked at the book of Jeremiah. Nebuchadnezzar throughout is seen as a sword in the hand of God. He is the sword of God's judgment. It's interesting here in chapter 21 that he says, I will draw my sword from its sheath, that's Nebuchadnezzar, and cut off from you both the righteous and the wicked. And it's interesting again to note this corporate way of thinking that everyone is affected and the people are treated as a whole. Now, Ezekiel's already dealt with the idea that we're not suffering for each other's sins, but there are corporate consequences. Yeah. So even though there's not corporate guilt in one sense, there are, however, corporate consequences. And we'll see this as we go through this.
Absolutely.
In other words, it matters to everyone how anyone else's, what everyone else's do does actually matter, because God wants to treat his people as a whole. And that's, I think, a very important theme here.
That's great.
He says, interesting, again, we've often noticed how personally the prophets have been drawn into this. And of course, Ezekiel is remarkable because he has to act out all of these things. And we're not done with that. No. There's some quite remarkable elements.
And remember, the reason Ezekiel has to act this out is very early on in the book. Remember, God silenced him where he couldn't speak except for when God gave him specific things to say.
That's right.
So he was having to act out a lot of these things, because we're going to see towards the end of this, or I think maybe as we go into the next section, where God releases him.
That's right.
No,
that's in today's. We'll cover that in today's episode. So in verse 6, he says, "Therefore, groan, Son of Man, groan before them." He's in exile, and the elders of Judah in exile, wondering what's happening back home, and are we going to, is Egypt going to come and save them, and Babylon's going to be destroyed, and we'll be set free? Yeah. Well, no, that's not going to happen. But they're coming to consult with Ezekiel. They're recognizing he's a prophetic guy. There's something going on with him. And so God says, groan before them with a broken and bitter grief. And when they ask you, why are you groaning? You shall say, because of the news that is coming. Probably, what he's been called to do here is the customary funereal
grief,
the
visual grief,
grief. That's right. And so that they had a question: why are you acting as though there's a funeral? There's in formal grief. Well,
Who's died kind of thing.
That's right. It's because this is now happening. This is imminent now, this destruction of Jerusalem. And so he's called to start grieving in anticipation of that. Interesting thing, too, as part of this prophecy, because this is now happening. This is actually unfolding now.
Moment, right at that
so
moment,
Nebuchadnezzar, right now, and this is, I think, remarkable because it says, the word of the Lord came to me, son of man, mark out 2 roads for the sword of the king of Babylon to take. So when Nebuchadnezzar came in, would he go to Jerusalem first or would he go to the Ammonites? Now, in the ancient world, when you made decisions, there was some recourse to strategic advantage, but a big part of the decision-making was consulting the omens.
Yes.
And so they would practice a number of different forms. They would use arrows symbolically. Another one, they would practice extaspacy, which is cutting open the animal, examining the liver.
I don't know what that was meant to tell you, but
yeah. And then you'd consult idols. There'd be something there that you do. So he does all of these 3 things, but Ezekiel's. And this is the interesting thing about that. Ezekiel is predicting what the outcome of the omens will be.
Yeah.
And this is significant because it shows that God is actually even,
of course,
even across that. It shows the superiority of the biblical prophets to the omens, because the biblical prophet already knows what the omen is going to do and where he's going to go as a result of the omens. Really interesting moment there. That's from verse 21 of chapter 21. For the king of Babylon will stop at the fork at the road, the junction of the 2 roads, to seek an omen. He will cast lots with arrows. He will consult his idols, and he will examine the liver. Into his right hand will come the lot for Jerusalem, where he is to set up battering rams to give the command to slaughter, to sound the battle cry. So there's the sense here in that God is going to make this lot fall, so that because this is the sword in God's hand, I'm going to cause this lot through the omens.
And the omens.
I'm going to cause it to go this way.
Yeah.
So ultimately, God is sovereign. There's no sense of in any other way of things working than that. So that's interesting to note there, Stu. So as we go into chapter 22, again, this corporate way of thinking comes back. He says, for example, here, see how each of the princes of Israel who are in you uses his power to shed blood. In you, they have treated, he's talking about God's people, in you they have treated father and mother with contempt. In you, they have oppressed the foreigner, mistreated the fatherless and the widow. Verse 9, in you are slanderers. In you are those who eat at mountain shrines. Verse 10, in you are those who dishonor their father's bed. Verse 11, in you, notice that, and it keeps going, actually, this is actually the problem. This is a problem for all of you.
Yeah.
Because judgment is coming because of the things that are being done in your midst. It's as, in some sense, everyone is going to bear the consequences of these sins.
In my translation, interestingly, it uses the term one man as though there's someone doing all of these things, at least someone doing all of these things, essentially.
Yeah,
as
right.
opposed to in you, it says one man does this and another man does that and one man does this. So interesting.
Yeah, but the sense of it is...
everyone's guilty.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, not guilty. Everyone's going to suffer the consequence of this cause. Yep.
Yeah. It's one of the problems, of course, and this is brought out in chapter 26, and this is a very significant verse, Stu. I'll just point to this for a moment. It says, her priests do violence to my law and profane my holy things. They do not distinguish between the holy and the common. They teach that there is no difference between the clean and the unclean. This is absolutely vital. This was built in to the Levitical law. God was training his people constantly to distinguish between the common, the profane and the sacred and the profane.
Yep.
You make sure you tell the difference between those 2 things, because he was calling them to be separated out. You are a holy people to reflect a holy God, and so be separate and get used to recognizing some things are sacred. And those things that are sacred cannot be treated in just about any other way.
Yeah.
And I think this is important because this is one of the things when we stray from God, this is one of the key things that goes wrong. We lose this sense of difference, of distinction between the sacred and the profane.
Yeah.
it's this, and we see that even in our society. There's no real, everything's up for grabs. There's no sense of the sacred.
Yeah.
I mean, that word gets thrown around a lot, but this is very, very important.
And particularly, in today's age, if we think about, and not solely in today's age, you think about the sacredness of human life.
Yeah.
And even the way we treat people that maybe we don't agree with or don't get on with, we often don't treat them with the sacredness that they should be treated.
That's right.
Every single person.
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely. He says down in verse 30, I looked for someone among them who would build up the wall to stand before me in the gap on behalf of the land so that I would not have to destroy it, but I found no one. He's going back a little way now and saying that there was no one really to intercede for this city. They've completely lost the plot.
And he'd actually commanded the prophets not to intercede for the city earlier as well.
That's right. Yeah, he had, because there came a point where it was
had
past
to be
the
purified.
point of not
it had to be
return.
purified.
That's
otherwise.
right. Yep. The rebellion of Israel and the use of metaphor is very strong in the prophets, and we have in chapter 23 this parable of the two sisters. So the two sisters are Israel and Judah. And we get this story of these two sisters. The older is named Aholah, and the younger is named Aholibah. So Aholah means her tent, and that's probably a reference to a place of worship, like a pagan shrine.
Yep.
That's talking, Aholah is representing the older sister, is representing Israel. The other daughter is Aholibah. She stands for Jerusalem. And interesting, the meaning of that is my tent is in her. It's interesting. So the first is her tent. She's doing her own thing in setting up their own shrines, but the name Aholibah means my tent is in her. So that's God's shrine.
Jerusalem.
So in a way, they had rebelled, the northern kingdom had rebelled against God by worshipping other gods, but because the shrine was in Jerusalem, there was even more serious offense, really, was profaning the name of God who was in their midst. And that becomes an important theme throughout Ezekiel's prophecies. It is, I would say, Stu, R-rated. I'd give this an R rating. This parable of the two sisters, it's very explicit language here. Of course, sexual sin is famously used throughout the prophets. In fact, right into the New Testament, sexuality becomes the image of choice to describe sin generally.
Was that because Baal, a big part of Baal worship was, that Ashtoreth, and the whole Ashtoreth pole thing, and the whole sexual promiscuousness and worship and all
so there were aspects of sexual practice involved in these various cults, and there were shrine prostitutes. That actually extends right into the New Testament period. That's still a big issue, actually, and it's behind some of the things that Paul says, for example, in Corinthians and so forth. So this becomes an ongoing issue. But it's interesting, actually, the connection of sexuality with idolatry. At another level, our sexuality is really the inner sanctum of our sacred selves. And so it's a very intimate point of access. It's a very soulful thing, sexuality. It's never just physical. And talk about, I said before about distinguishing between the sacred and profane. I mean, sexuality in our culture is treated as something very profane. It's there for pleasure and it doesn't matter, and it's all just physical. And yet deep down we know that it's not just physical, because when our sexuality is violated in some ways, there's a very, very deep and I would say spiritual kind of trauma that goes with that cannot be accounted for except in the understanding that something absolutely sacred has been violated, and there's this terrible sense of
violation.
Of violation. So the connection between sexuality and spirituality throughout Scripture is a very, very close one. And it's often, some of the most extreme forms of shame that, as a pastor, that I know that people carry often relates to sexuality, because it really goes very deep. And so you see that connection here in the way that their rebellion is described. It's described in very sexualized terms. And that's customarily the way that it's done, because in a sense, what he's saying is that this idolatry has gone to the inner sanctum of their lives. This is what, that the idols have gained access to a place in their lives that should have been reserved for Yahweh God alone. So that's the idea of a very, very explicit description of this. And of course, down in verse 31 here, we have this mention of this cup, that because of all of this, God is going to hand her the cup of God's wrath. It's a customary way of depicting your just deserts.
So because Israel had already drunk the cup and Judah hadn't learnt from Israel, they were now going to drink the same
And that's
cup.
the issue here, that the younger sister had not learned from the older sister, and so now the cup is being handed to her. And of course, I point this out because of, in the Garden of Gethsemane, famously, Jesus has this cup in mind. And he said, if it is not possible for this cup to be taken away unless I drink it, may your will be done. And of course, Jesus took the cup of our just deserts, as it were, and he takes it, for us. And so that imagery there, we've seen, we see it in the other prophets, but we see it here again in Ezekiel. In chapter 24, now we have this marks the beginning of the siege of Jerusalem. So and this is given a date. In the 9th year, in the 10th month, on the 10th day, the word of the Lord came to me. Son of man, record this date. So this is 588 BC. The siege is going to end in 586 BC. The final destruction of the city is going to happen in 586 BC. So record this date, this very date, because the king of Babylon has laid siege to Jerusalem this very day. Now, remember, it took there's no phone lines. Oh, this is what's going
didn't
on.
have email back in those days.
That's right.
Messenger.
No, that's right. So it would take often months for this message
to get back
to that distance, right? So he says, mark the day. And the idea is so that it will be known that you've told it well. So because a messenger is going to come, and the messenger is going to come and say, on this day, Jerusalem was laid siege and after the destruction. And so he says, mark the date so that you know that this has all been predicted.
Which means everything else that Ezekiel has said also can be trusted.
Exactly. That's right. So we have a prophetic act. Put on the cooking pot, put it on, and put into it pieces of meat. So the pot represents Jerusalem, the meat represents the inhabitants. Bring it to boil. It's basically a way of saying things are now heating up, right? The people in Jerusalem is no longer a place of safety and salvation. It has now become a pot, a boiling pot. So it's a bleak outlook here. Now, around this time, Ezekiel's wife dies, Stu. This is interesting. And we've seen before how Ezekiel is called to act out these oracles in very costly ways to him. Well, here he is forbidden from mourning his wife. Now, when I say forbidden from mourning his wife,
outwardly, anyway,
doesn't mean that he can't be sad. He is forbidden from observing the normal customary mourning activities that would happen for about a month. So it was always a communal thing. So the community would come together, and Ezekiel and his wife were very connected into the community. So imagine someone, even in our context, something like this would cause a stir. But in that context, when the death of anyone prompted this customary mourning and so forth, to not do that.
That would grab everyone's attention pretty quickly.
That's right.
And interesting that refers, because if you remember earlier, God had told him to groan, which was the outward sort of expression of grief for what was going to happen at Jerusalem. Now he's saying you can't groan.
That's right.
You have to not even show, and as you say, all the other customary tradition. So, it's
interesting, isn't it, that he has been told to observe, in anticipation of the destruction of Jerusalem, observe the customary mourning. And now that his wife dies, no, because the people in Jerusalem are not going to have a chance to mourn. They're not going to have a chance to bury their dead, because you would bury your dead outside the walls of the city. They're not going to be able to do that. So there's not going to be any funeral stuff going on here. And also they're going to be taken into exile before they can bury their dead and so forth. So, I mean...
So Ezekiel's
that's what
actually
this is about.
feeling the consequence for himself personally of what's going to be happening.
That's
for
right.
Those in
So he's
Jerusalem.
told, as when he was told to observe a near starvation siege diet, Stu, for about a year, now he's being told to go through this same deprivation, not being able to mourn his own wife.
Yeah.
And this, again, is going to get people's attention. I mean, this is enormous what's happening here and very impacting for the people back then. There's a tragedy in verse 21, Stu. Say to the people of Israel, this is what the sovereign Lord says, I'm about to desecrate my sanctuary, the stronghold in which you take pride, the delight of your eyes. And they would never have thought that this would happen.
Yeah.
Surely God will save his temple.
Yeah.
And in fact, it was unusual for conquering armies often to tear down places of worship around this time because they were superstitious enough not to mention that. You tear down the walls and
Everything but. Yeah.
yeah. And Nebuchadnezzar would not have done this except that it had just gotten to this place where the whole thing was ridiculous and they were rebelling against him so many times over and over again. So that's why he ends up destroying the city the way that he does. But there's an element of grief here. I'm about to desecrate my sanctuary. So again, he says in verse 24, Ezekiel will be a sign to you. You will do just as he has done when this happens. You will know that I am the sovereign Lord. Again, just noticing the frequency of that statement. When this happens, you will know that I am the Lord, because you will know that I've predicted it. I've sent my prophet. You better know that I am God over everything, even what's happening there, what's happening here in Babylon.
And what's going to happen.
And soon, and in the next chapter, what's happening in the nations.
Yes.
So now we have oracles against the nations.
Chapter 25. Yep.
That's right. And it's interesting that he says there that you still have the repetition of this formula because it says, when I inflict punishment on, Ammon and Moab and Edom, then they will know that I am the Lord.
Yeah.
So they will know that I am the Lord too. And Philistia as well. So that's the big theme that even works through there. So that they would know that it's not their gods that are ultimately in control, that Yahweh is God above all the gods. With all of these oracles against the nations, and that's what we get here now. Again, this can be, I think, for people difficult reading because what's all this, what's the point of all of this? Well, the point is that Yahweh is showing his sovereignty. They are going to be punished. The whole land is going to be punished. It's not just Israel and Judah. There's this general judgment that's coming upon the land. And
particularly those around Israel, they had rejoiced. God knew would be rejoicing in Israel and Judah's downfall. Yeah. Interesting, there's 7 nations that are listed here. The sense of completeness, it's done. Yeah.
And the idea here is that this judgment is coming upon these 7 nations. And normally, remember the situation in Egypt during the Exodus. So Egypt was judged, but the punishment passed over the Israelites.
Yes.
But now the judgment does not pass over the Israelites. This is the key thing here.
Right.
So he's saying it's not just coming on you. It's not just about you. Judgment is coming on that part of the world.
Yes.
And you are not going to be spared. That's that's the key thing there. And there's a focus here on Tyre, on the Phoenicians, which is Tyre and Sidon.
Yep.
Tyre and Sidon were both Phoenician states, and I'll say something about the Phoenicians in a moment because it's very important. And Egypt. So we have long sections here. Why the focus on the Phoenicians and on Egypt? Because they actually withstood that initial incursion. So when Jerusalem was destroyed during the same campaign, the other nations, Philistia, Edom, Moab, and Ammon, were all destroyed as well. But Tyre and Egypt still hold out. And so there are these prolonged oracles for them so that people know that
they're not going to miss out.
They're not going to miss out. You know what I mean? Because, they're standing tall and proud. Oh, look at us. We've been able to withstand.
Yeah. And they were probably
incursion.
2 very powerful, other than Babylon, 2 of the other most powerful certainly Egypt. Tyre was probably more known as the commercial hub of the world, really, the known world at the time. But certainly both of them very significant nations and cities.
Yeah,
at that
that's
time.
right. Yeah. So it's worth saying something about them. So the Phoenicians, this is Tyre and Sidon.
Yep.
Now it's Mark chapter 7. there's a story about a Syro-Phoenician woman who expresses great faith. The story is recorded in Matthew chapter 15 as well. So she's from that, from that sort of area. Yep. So Tyre and Sidon are two Phoenician states. The Phoenicians were so powerful because they were merchants, shipping merchants. They were shipbuilders and famous sailors. When Jonah fled from the Lord, it was in a Phoenician ship that he went from Tarshish. So this is an enormously powerful nation state. Tyre was built just offshore. It was like an island city. So very defensible, a little bit like Florence.
Well, there were two parts of it, wasn't there? There was the Tyre Island, which was pretty much a walled island. Then there was the inland, on land, and that really just was there to supply water and supplies to the walled city, which was on the island. Interesting also, Tyre was where Jesus went when the Jews just weren't going to be listening, and he goes to Tyre and spends 7 days, I think it is, or 7 nights with his disciples in Tyre.
Yeah, that's right. So. Yeah, and it's interesting that, because it's the Phoenicians were referred to as Canaanites, actually, when it talks about Canaanites, because the Phoenicians were the most powerful of the Canaanites, arguably the sort of ruling presence in that region. So Canaanites is often used in the Bible to refer to all of the people west of the Jordan. But actually it was the Phoenicians that really were. So that's why in Matthew 15, this Syro-Phoenician woman is also referred to as a Canaanite woman.
Right.
And it's interesting that she becomes, the two great examples of faith in the Gospels during the ministry of Jesus are the faith of the centurion, the Roman centurion, right? Yeah. And the faith of the Syro-Phoenician or Canaanite woman. Yeah. So even in those days,
so this was the woman whose child was, or I think it was her son, was suffering from a really severe illness, and Jesus came and healed.
Yeah, that's right.
The other interesting thing about Tyre, which I did a little bit of research on this because I'm reading through this passage and going, man, Tyre gets a lot of attention here.
Yeah, it does, yeah.
And we'll come to a number of the reasons. But the interesting thing I discovered was a lot of its wealth was actually produced from exporting purple dye because it was very rare. And they knew how to make it, and could make it, had the resources to make it. And of course, purple then became, because of its rarity, known as the royal colour. Yeah. And of course, Jesus had a purple robe put on him by Caesar at the point of his crucifixion. And so purple was, the whole colour, purple was a big income earner for the city of Tyre at the time. So, and massive trading kind of city.
Solomon was quite closely connected with Tyre. He was quite dependent upon them. This became a problem for Solomon.
The cities of Lebanon that went into the temple.
That's right.
Via Tyre because they had the ability to ship them.
Exactly. Yeah. And a lot of his trade was, he was utilizing their ships and their sailors for his trade, even right down in the Gulf of Aqaba, which is right down south. Yep. And even there were ships from Tyre that were shipping his copper and so forth. So this becomes an issue, of course, that alliance in Israel becomes an issue because they become so dependent on the Phoenicians, on Tyre and Sidon, that this is why Jezebel is a Phoenician princess, and she really holds sway over Ahab. So the most famous kind of evil, one of the most famous evil people in the history of Israel in the Old Testament, Jezebel, is a Phoenician as well. So they established. They were also the great colonizers in the ancient world. So they originated out of the area of Canaan, and then they they established the city of Carthage, Cyprus. They went right. They had colonies in Spain as well. So they went all over the place. These guys
and Baal worshippers. Baal
worshippers. That's right. So this oracle is against this city of Tyre, which when Nebuchadnezzar does come against, so they don't get off scot-free as he prophesies. And he's using all of the standard prophetic language here. And what happens eventually is that there's a siege. Because they're an island, he doesn't get in as such. But he does
starve them out. Basically.
He does starve them out, and they do surrender.
Yeah. Quite a long
time. So they do fall in that sense under the king of Babylon, And
a 13-year siege and very costly to the Babylonians.
Yeah,
I
that's
suspect,
right.
So he was probably pretty angry.
Yeah, that's right. And
Again.
actually, Ezekiel says later on that he comes away without. And how does he put it?
No spoil, or no
without any
payment
spoil.
for the
no
wages of
payment for it. Yeah.
Probably what happened is that they surrendered and it became a puppet state,
Yeah.
which I think we know did happen.
Yeah, that's
of
right.
Babylon, but it meant they couldn't ransack the city and take all the spoils.
Yeah.
So he then went on to Egypt, of course.
That's right. So this is a modern day sort of Lebanon now,
Yes,
is where these cities are. So Ezekiel is told to take up a lament, like a funeral lament over Tyre, which that's in chapter 27. So he composes this lament. He laments over Tyre, gives this sort of funeral, this funeral lament, even before Tyre has fallen. And then we have this interesting section in chapter 28, which is a prophecy against the king of Tyre. And it's really against the pride. And here, Tyre as this very, very powerful group and colonizers as well. So going out and conquering other places.
And taking Baal with them.
That's important.
Yeah.
And so they are, so Tyre is indicted for this godlike pride in right at the start there in chapter 2, verse 2 of chapter 28. In the pride of your heart you say, I am a god. I sit on the throne of a god in the heart of the seas. But you are a mere mortal and not a god, he says. Though you think you are as wise as a god, are you wiser than Daniel? Interesting. There's another reference to Daniel, who was renowned for his wisdom. Is no secret hidden. So he's speaking to the pride of Tyre, and then he says, "Take up a lament." Having lamented against Tyre itself, he says, "Take up a lament concerning the king of Tyre." Now, the interesting thing about this section, this is from verse 11 onwards, Stu, is the way that it actually references Genesis 1 to 3.
Yeah.
And there's not really much in the scriptures that directly references those earlier chapters. It definitely sits in the background. But this is a direct allusion to this Genesis, this early Genesis tradition, which shows that this is already around. Now, as a lot of people say that those early chapters of Genesis, at least, were written during the exile or after or sometime.
Right.
Now, it may be that they received a final formal form in that period. That there's no problem with that. But what this shows is that tradition actually has been with the Jewish people already up to this point, right? Because this is early on in their exile, and there's this assumption here on the part of Yahweh and of Ezekiel that they'll get this illusion that this is a very commonly understood thing.
Yeah.
And so the story of Genesis 1 to 11, which we associate with Moses, we talk about the books of Moses.
Yes.
And I think there's no reason to doubt that this had been carried, right from that time. And perhaps it may, as I said, may have received its final form, literary form, in the exilic period, but certainly they've carried it with us. And one senses that even Genesis chapter 1 is there's so much rhythm and structure to that passage. It looks like the sort of thing that was created almost for memorization.
Right.
Even the amount of times that certain words are used. There's this word 10 times, this word 10 times, this word 7 times. So it was a very core tradition. But it's interesting that tradition is actually now referred to here. So with respect to the king of Tyre. So Ezekiel says, "You were the seal of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone adorned you: carnelian, chrysolite, emerald, topaz, onyx." Now, when we think of precious stones, particularly, we think of the breastplate of the priest. Yes. There's some perhaps allusion that there was like this priest-like role or authority given to human beings in the garden. On the day you were created, they were prepared. Now, it goes on to say in verse 14, though, "You were anointed as a guardian cherub." You remember the cherub in the garden with the flaming sword? That they had a guardian role.
Right.
For so I endured. You were on the holy mount of God. You walked among the fiery stones. So garden and mountain sort of go together. In fact, we could probably see the Garden of Eden almost as what would later be seen as almost like a mountain shrine. The Garden of Eden was this sacred space, and sacred spaces were often subsequently on mountaintops, which was seen to sort of overlap with the heavens in the ancient way of thinking. So the mountain of God is another way of speaking of this sacred space, the Garden of Eden. It says, you were blameless in all your ways from the day you were created till wickedness was found in you. And then he says, so I drove you in disgrace from the mount of God, and I expelled you, guardian cherub, from among the fiery stones. Your heart became proud on account of your beauty, and you corrupted your wisdom because of your splendor. So I threw you to the earth. I made a spectacle of you before kings. By your many sins and dishonest trade, you have desecrated your sanctuary. So I've made fire come out from you, and it consumed you. So there's this sense that the judgment was already within. And now, what do you think, Stu? When you read this, you think to yourself, "Hang on, who are we talking about?"
Yeah,
here?
that's right.
Are we talking about? This doesn't sound like it's talking about the King of Tyre. It sounds like at first it's. Sounds like it's talking about Adam and Eve, and then it sounds like a guardian cherub. And from the intertestamental period, even through to the early church period, this was interpreted as talking about Satan, essentially.
Or Lucifer before Satan.
Well, Lucifer, that's right.
Essentially before Satan, in a sense.
So this fallen angel.
Yes, correct.
So this is the thing, that there appears to be this tradition about this, that we don't have the information, apart from Genesis, of course, we have Genesis. But there seems to be another tradition out there, or some framework in which this was understood. And I think this is characterizing the King of Tyre with this demonic pride that we see both in Adam and Eve, but also in Satan himself. And we would identify, well, not everyone does, but I certainly would identify Satan with Lucifer and the devil and so forth. I think there's a pretty consistent sort of identification throughout the scriptures.
We also see a little bit of a reference maybe to this in Job 1, where it says, God gathered and Satan came amongst the people. Where have you been? I've been, on the earth. So it's like, it is interesting, because it's like in this reference in Ezekiel, whoever this is in heaven, a bit like Satan was
that's right.
in Job's situation.
Yeah.
So it's
now there are some people that say that that the Satan there is like a kind of an accusing spirit or something. But I mean, I think the best way to understand this consistently is to see this as, as essentially the same, identifying the same being, the same fallen angel. I mean, it's hard to know for sure.
But essentially, it's really about the sin and evil in the heart.
That's right.
Of the city.
That's
in
right.
Reality.
But
this is the ruler of Tyre. This is who this is.
That's right. So, but what's interesting is that it's referring to this, the Genesis 1-3 tradition to cast him. This is so his sin becomes an example of a universal human predicament. That actually has its origin in some kind of spiritual realm. Some kind of spiritual fall as well, like the fall of a guardian cherub who was thrown to earth. And all of that is together. It's all part of the same thing.
Yes.
So the rebellion of the King of Tyre as a worldly authority with a lot of power in cahoots with the sin of the original pair, because that affected everyone, and their sin in turn was in cahoots with the sin of this guardian cherub, Lucifer. So very interesting section there in chapter 28.
Can I just allude to a historical thing that I found really interesting before we move in beyond that in terms of Tyre, because Ezekiel's prophecy talks about Tyre being completely destroyed.
Yeah.
In fact, it talks about the rubble of Tyre essentially being drawn into the sea. And we actually don't see that happen with the Babylonian conquest. In essence, the
No,
walled
that's right.
city, the island, actually stays intact and becomes a puppet state, for want of a better word, for the Babylonians. But 250 years later, Alexander the Great comes along, and he does totally destroy the city. And in fact, he destroys the land city first. So remember, Tyre was an island city, and then also part of it was on land, like a suburb, I guess. And he destroys the land-based one because, of course, he didn't have ships. He had foot soldiers, which isn't a lot of help when the island's a kilometre out in sea. But in destroying that city, he then builds a land bridge across to this island by dragging, as Ezekiel says, your rubble and your rock will be drawn into the sea, by dragging it into the sea, and ultimately does completely destroy the island city of Tyre. So, what Ezekiel said in the end fully came to pass.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's amazing what these ancient conquerors did.
Yeah.
I mean, the classic one, and we'll tell this story when we get to Daniel, is what Cyrus did to conquer the city of Babylon. That story is so full on. Yeah. But we'll get to that.
So the interesting thing is that Tyre was never an island again. To this day, it's now a peninsula because of the works that were done by Alexander the Great. And so, as it says, it will never exist again. Well, it doesn't.
But their currency, tell us about, you were
I also discovered that the currency, because Tyre was such a major trading partner, and that continued for quite some time, the shekel was actually the Tyre currency that was, and it had the image of Baal on it. And in Jesus' time, the shekel that's referred to, both the shekel that Judas would have used or would have been paid to betray Jesus, but also the temple tax in Jerusalem was collected, had to be converted into the shekels. So when Jesus is casting out the money changers in the temple courts, where essentially there, as everyone's coming, they're trading there or transferring their Roman currency potentially into shekels, those guys are actually providing Tyre shekels with Baal's image, or not Baal, what was this, the Baal, Melgart, I think it is, this image on it. So just interesting how all these things tie together, isn't it?
It is. It's very interesting. At the end of chapter 28, it says this is what the sovereign Lord says: I will gather the people of Israel from the nations where they have been scattered. So this is oracles of hope, which are scattered throughout these essentially prophecies of doom. But he goes on to say here, I will be proved holy through them in the sight of the nations. That is, by them being gathered back. Then they will live in their own land, and so on. It's an interesting statement. And I just was thinking about this, Stu, about what it means for God to be proved holy. What does it mean for God to be proved holy? The sense here is that this is a world in which there were many different gods. And what is the consistent thing that God wants people to know, and this is also what comes out of this repeated phrase throughout the book of Ezekiel, then they will know that I am the Lord, is that God doesn't want to be identified with all of these other gods. I'm not a spiritual being like this. Don't treat me like another god. I'm absolutely distinct and above and transcendent. That there is the vast, infinite difference between me and these other gods, which are really not gods. I mean, the idols in this, they're not really gods. It's not denying that there are some spiritual entities perhaps behind these, but there's this consistent message, particularly as comes through the Psalms, that God is Yahweh is far above all other gods. Psalm 98 and so forth. He is far above all other gods. So that's what it means for God to be proved holy. It means that he is transcendent and distinct from any other spiritual beings, far above and in complete sovereign control of everything.
So my translation again, just when I gather the house of Israel from the peoples where they are scattered and demonstrate my holiness through them in the sight of the nations, they will live in their own land, which I gave to my servant Jacob.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So it's almost like I'm true to my word.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's right. So you're reading from the...
I'm reading from the CSB.
Which is now...
the Christian Standard Bible.
Yeah, it's now the Christian Standard Bible. I'm reading from the NIV. That actually rates really well. I was reading some ratings of translation, and the
CSB?
The CSB actually rates really well. Anyway, that's just an aside. Talking about translation. So we move into chapter 29, and now we have all of this material about Egypt. And this is important because, of course, when people think of archaeology and ancient history, generally Egypt. is the I guess the most famous because of what they've left behind. I mean, the pyramids and the pharaohs and all of the archaeological stuff, Tutankhamun and all of that. This is probably in some ways has been the most fascinating period of ancient history for archaeologists.
Or even anyone, if you think about ancient civilizations, people would probably first of all go straight to
they think of Egypt. That's right. And actually they were enormously powerful, and even at this time, now around this time, they're just coming to the end of their power. Pretty much, the Battle of Carchemish is really, they withdraw, but they do lose that battle, and the Babylonians, because it's Egypt and Assyria are fighting together against the Babylonians. Babylonians win, Egypt withdraw. What is significant about these prophecies is that Ezekiel is essentially prophesying the fact that this is the end of Egypt's greatness.
Yeah.
And it actually is. Yep. It's that they are no longer, after the period, once they're conquered by the Babylonians, once the Babylonians do sweep in and they take over, they never really recover their greatness again. This is the end of the famous ancient Egypt that everyone knows about.
Yes.
They're all now, in the future, they're going to be an important part of the Greek Empire. So it's not that Egypt isn't going to become an important center. And of course, Alexandria becomes a very famous center of the Greek Empire later on. But this is not Egypt anymore. No, this is not an independent Egypt. This is the end. And Ezekiel prophesies it. Ezekiel's basically saying you are not going to rise again.
And at a time where they no one could possibly imagine that would be true.
Oh, that's right.
I mean, at this point in time, the people in exile are probably still hoping that the superpower of Egypt is going to rescue them from the Babylonians, even though Ezekiel's been telling them that ain't going to happen. Egypt was like, what?
Yeah, exactly. Just note verse 7 here, Stu, that here Egypt is being blamed for being a splintered staff. The Judah in her last days depended on Egypt to save them, and Egypt made all of these promises, but didn't come through, and so that became, so in a sense, and actually this is in Isaiah chapter 36 in verse 6, Isaiah actually warned, this is the interesting thing about this, Isaiah warned Judah, don't lean on Pharaoh,
on the Egyptians.
Do not lean on the Egyptians, because they will be like a splintered staff. You're going to injure yourself by leaning on the staff. But even though Isaiah warned the people of Judah not to do that, and though she still does, and of course the staff is a splintered staff, and all of that came about, yet Egypt is still blamed for being a splinter staff.
Yes.
Because again, remember the covenant is those who bless you I will bless, and those who curse you I will curse. So even though people of Judah should not have turned and relied on Pharaoh in the first place, but the fact that Pharaoh still let them down works against the Egyptians.
Yeah, right.
So that's an interesting moment there.
And he even uses the same, and as you say in verse 7, when Israel grasped you by the hand, you splintered, tearing all their shoulders, and when they leaned onto you, you shattered and made all their hips unsteady.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So the oracles over Egypt, we've got lots of material here, Stu, and we don't really need to get into this in any detail. But again, you have the repeated formula. I just keep repeating, and then they will know that I'm the Lord. They will know that I'm the Lord when I do this. And so Pharaoh was cast as a great cedar of Lebanon.
Yes,
that is formed. This is a very important moment in Egyptian history, and as Ezekiel is calling in world history.
Yeah,
and Ezekiel's calling it. Egypt is going to go down. And interestingly, in chapter 31, he says that Egypt is going to go down into Sheol with the, actually in chapter 32, Egypt goes down into the realm of the dead, into the part of the realm of the dead, or Sheol, that is reserved for the uncircumcised. The interesting thing is the Egyptians actually did practice circumcision. So he's talking about a uncircumcised in the sense of not set apart for God. That the Egyptians are going to go into the deepest part of the grave. So this is a very decisive oracle against.
There's no coming back.
Against and this is, remember, this is against a nation that have figured since Genesis chapter 12. We're going right. This is what's significant about Egypt. Right from Genesis chapter 12, when Abraham goes down into Egypt, remember Pharaoh takes Abraham's wife and suffers the curse. Well, right from that point through to the Exodus, and Egypt has played a major part. Yeah, of course, Egypt would, because they were such a key player in the ancient world. But they have played a very big part in the history of Israel and Judah, and here Ezekiel refers to this final downfall. So this is God ruling over the nations. This is not just a parochial God of one nation. This is a sovereign God who rules over all and is declaring the downfall of nations, is declaring things that are happening even while they're, casting their lots and seeking their omens. God calls it first, right? God determines the outcome of even those things. This is a sovereign God who rules over all. And the most important thing for us to know is to know this God. And this is right through the prophecies of Ezekiel. I'm going to do this, whether you suffer punishment or whether you suffer redemption. It is all so that you would know who is God.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Thrive Deeper. Our home on the internet is thrivetoday.tv. You can contact us, ask questions, see all our resources and much more at our website thrivetoday.tv. We really appreciate the questions and thoughts about what you're reading as we go through the Bible with Thrive. Until next time, our prayer is that these shows will inspire you to go deeper and thrive.